All right, we've got some breaking news from the United Kingdom and the royal family.
Queen Camilla has just issued a request that immediately left Prince Edward with a sense that something was not right. Bagshot Park, the house he and Sophie had made their home for many years, was suddenly placed under review, while at almost the same moment, the Duchess of Edinburgh's personal jewellery was ordered to be inventoried once more. On the surface, everything was explained with perfectly reasonable justifications. Yet Edward soon realized the matter was far from simple. More striking still, it all unfolded while King Charles was setting aside time to monitor his health. That fact left Edward to face alone the mounting pressure coming from Queen Camilla's side. Edward decided to search through the old papers left by Queen Elizabeth II, but the more he examined them, the more he saw something troubling. It seemed someone was deliberately working to strip away every right his family still held. So what is truly taking place behind this review that appears so ordinary? And will Prince Edward uncover the truth before it is too late? In recent weeks, King Charles had been forced to scale back his duties while monitoring his health. Life at Buckingham Palace took on an unfamiliar rhythm. Important meetings were shortened, major decisions postponed, and the day-to-day running of affairs gradually shifted to the offices around him. It was into this vacuum that Queen Camilla's office began advancing a proposal for a comprehensive review of royal assets. The stated aims were clear and reasonable: to cut operating costs, standardize management practices, and ensure every property and valuable item was brought under centralized control, avoiding waste at a time when the budget was under increasing pressure. At first, the proposal attracted little special attention. Most people within the palace regarded it as routine administration, something that needed doing from time to time. The lists drawn up were broad, from the great residences to agricultural holdings, from historic jewelry to art collections. Everything proceeded smoothly until the name Bagshot Park appeared among the properties requiring closer examination. Bagshot Park was no empty house. It had been the home of Prince Edward and the Duchess of Edinburgh under a long-term agreement approved years earlier by Queen Elizabeth II herself. That arrangement not only permitted the couple to occupy the house, it also required them to take responsibility for its maintenance, repairs, and upkeep. Over the years, Edward had spent a considerable sum keeping the place in good order. The sudden inclusion of Bagshot Park in the review therefore came as a surprise to many of those close to the family. At the same time as the notice concerning Bagshot Park, another request reached Sophie's office. Camilla's side asked for an inventory of certain pieces of jewelry the Duchess still wore at official engagements. Among them was the tiara she had received on her wedding day. The reason given was the need to protect the royal heritage and to clarify provenance to avoid any unnecessary disputes in the future. No one could object to so conservation-minded a justification. Yet for Sophie, the request touched objects that carried deep personal meaning. Prince Edward received both notices almost on the same day. He was at Bagshot Park when his private secretary brought the papers. At first, he read them with calm detachment, assuming they were merely administrative procedures, part of the wider effort to reduce the royal household's costs. Years inside the system had accustomed him to periodic checks of this kind. But when he saw that both the house in which his family lived and the personal jewelry of his wife had been placed under review together, he paused longer. The Duchess of Edinburgh sat opposite him in the small study. She held the request for the jewelry inventory, her fingers tightening slightly on the paper. Her voice was quieter than usual. "They want it back, but they also want me to prove the tiara was a private gift, not crown property." Edward looked at his wife, then back at the list that included Bagshot Park. He did not answer at once. In his mind, the two matters began to connect. On one side stood the house the family occupied under a long-term agreement. On the other stood a piece of jewelry Sophie had received from the late Queen. Both had remained relatively independent of central control, and both had been brought into the same review at the same moment. He laid the paper on the desk, his voice lower. "They've chosen a moment when my brother is abroad." Sophie said nothing more. The atmosphere in the room grew heavy. Edward was not a man given to suspicion. He still wanted to believe this was only paperwork. Yet the coincidence left him unable to feel entirely at ease. In the days that followed the two notices, Edward could no longer maintain his earlier composure. He asked his private secretary for fuller details of the Bagshot Park review. The official answers remained administrative in tone, an examination of maintenance costs, efficiency of use, and the possibility of optimizing resources. But as he pressed further, the auditor's questions gradually shifted. They were no longer concerned only with the annual sums spent on the house. They began to inquire about the remaining term of the lease, the practical control of the land, and whether the Crown Estate might reclaim Bagshot Park if the agreement no longer fitted the new management policy of the royal household. Edward sat in his study reading each line of the documents sent to him. He realized the review had already moved far beyond ordinary cost-cutting. It was touching the legal foundation of the right of occupation his family held. The long-term agreement once approved by Queen Elizabeth II was now being placed under a questioning light. No one said outright that the house would be taken back, yet the possibility had been introduced with careful skill. At the same time, Sophie encountered her own difficulties over the jewelry inventory. The inspectors did not stop at listing the pieces. They required clear proof that the tiara she had received on her marriage was a private gift and not crown property. Sophie searched out the old correspondence, but the language was formal and ceremonial rather than tightly legal. Each time she explained, further evidence was demanded. One evening, the couple sat opposite each other in the small drawing room at Bagshot Park. Silence stretched for some time before Sophie spoke. "They won't accept the Queen's letters. They want clearer documents of provenance." Edward looked at his wife, his voice low. "Bagshot Park is the same. They're asking about control and the possibility of taking the house back." Sophie leaned forward slightly. "Do you think the two things are connected?" Edward did not answer at once. He rose and walked a few paces across the room. In his mind, the events began to link. On one side, the house the family occupied under a long-term agreement. On the other, the jewelry Sophie had received from the late Queen. Both had stood outside central management. Both had been brought into the same review, and both were being pushed towards a narrowing of the family's independent control. He stopped and spoke slowly. "They may simply want everything returned to central management, but I have no direct proof yet." Sophie watched her husband, anxiety plain on her face. She understood that speaking out too soon without evidence could complicate matters further. Edward understood it too. He was not a man who liked open confrontation, especially while the king was still reducing his workload for health reasons. So he chose another course. He instructed his private solicitor and his secretary to gather every contract relating to Bagshot Park, every renewal, every record of repairs, and every sum the family had spent over the years. Everything was kept inside the house, never sent through official channels, never allowed to leak outside. In the days that followed, Edward worked with great care. He sent no formal letter of protest. He requested no meeting with Camilla. He simply collected quietly. Each new document was read carefully and compared with what the auditors were asking. The differences grew clearer. The way they described the right of occupation at Bagshot Park in the current papers was quite different from the language of the old agreement. The way they classified the tiara did not match the wording of earlier correspondence. Sophie noticed that her husband spoke less and less. The quiet evenings now carried an unspoken tension. They knew that without direct evidence pointing to who stood behind the moves, every suspicion remained only conjecture. Yet Edward also understood that if he sat still, the family's control could be narrowed gradually without anyone noticing in time. So he continued to collect and to watch. Outside, the review proceeded with the outward appearance of ordinary administration. Inside Bagshot Park, suspicion had begun to grow, and Edward knew he could not allow it to rest there. In truth, before the official notices ever reached Bagshot Park, Queen Camilla had already held private discussions with a small group of trusted financial and legal advisors. She did not speak of the matter in large meetings. Everything took place in closed sessions, usually late in the day, when the palace had grown quieter. Camilla asked them to draw up a list of assets that still lay outside the central management system of the royal household. She wanted to know clearly what remained under relatively independent control by other members of the family and what might be brought back under common oversight. On that list, Bagshot Park could not be overlooked. The value of the property was considerable. Its location was convenient, its scale substantial, and above all, the lease held by Edward was extremely long. That agreement had been approved by Queen Elizabeth II and carried with it the family's commitment to maintain the house. To Camilla, this was a notable weakness, a valuable asset lying outside direct central control. Sophie's jewelry, particularly the tiara received on her marriage, was included for a different stated reason: the protection of the royal heritage. That reason sounded entirely proper and hard to challenge. Camilla never issued a direct order of repossession. She understood that a command from her side would easily turn into open confrontation, and while the king was reducing his work for health reasons, any conflict could produce unwanted consequences. She therefore chose another method. She required that everything be presented under administrative responsible justifications that would be difficult to criticize. In one closed meeting, a legal advisor asked outright, "What if Edward reacts strongly? He may take the matter straight to the king." Camilla looked at the speaker, her voice calm but firm. "Keep everything within procedural bounds. Do not allow it to become a confrontation. We are simply doing what needs to be done." That approach allowed the plan to advance without creating large waves. Documents were drafted with care. Camilla's name rarely appeared in the sensitive passages. Instructions were passed through intermediate levels so that the source became hard to trace. Her aim was not immediate seizure. It was to create a legal and administrative basis for gradually narrowing the independent control of Edward's family. Once that control had been sufficiently reduced, the opportunity to bring the assets under stricter management would arise naturally. Camilla looked further ahead. If Bagshot Park and those pieces of jewelry eventually came under the central system, her office would have a greater voice in deciding how they were used. And if the right moment arrived, a portion might be adjusted in ways more favorable to her own position. But everything had to proceed slowly, step by step, under the covering of reasonableness and responsibility. While Edward began gathering papers at Bagshot Park, Camilla's side continued to push the plan forward. Internal meetings became more frequent. Drafts were revised many times, yet kept their original direction. No one in the advisory group was permitted to state the true objective. They were simply reminded again and again that the work was necessary to protect royal assets in difficult times. Camilla watched from a distance. She did not need to appear in every small detail. She needed only to ensure that nothing went off course. To her, this was not an open battle. It was an adjustment of power carried out in the shadows of procedure. And she believed that if patience were maintained, the final result would arrive without the need for any confrontation at all. While Camilla's side continued to advance the review under its procedural cover, Edward began to act more systematically. He no longer relied only on his secretary to collect documents. He personally instructed the family's private solicitor to review the entire Bagshot Park agreement, the successive renewals over the years, and the sums he had spent on repairs and improvements. The solicitor was summoned to Bagshot Park on a quiet morning. The two men sat opposite each other in the study, a thick file of papers before them. The solicitor turned the pages of the old contracts, slowly comparing them with current terms. The initial findings offered a measure of reassurance. Edward's right of occupation was reasonably well protected. The agreement could not easily be altered by an internal decision of any single royal office. The substantial investments the family had made over the years further strengthened their legal position. The solicitor stated clearly, if they wish to take the house back, they will need far stronger legal grounds than an ordinary cost review. Edward nodded, yet he did not relax completely. He knew that solid paperwork did not mean the pressure would cease. He asked the solicitor to dig deeper still, searching for every small detail that might be exploited. At the same time, Sophie did not remain idle. She began searching through every record relating to the tiara and the other gifts she had received from Queen Elizabeth II. Old letters were taken from private storage boxes. The language was formal, warm, and clearly affirmed that these were personal gifts made to Sophie as a member of the family. Nowhere were they recorded as common crown property. Sophie brought the papers to her husband. Together, they compared them with the way the current inventory was describing the items. Edward saw the difference at once. In the old files, the tiara was classified as a private gift. In the present requests, it was being edged towards the category of common property, requiring protection and central management. The wording differed markedly. He laid the sheets side by side on the desk and studied them for a long time. He understood that even this clear difference was not yet direct evidence of deliberate intervention by Camilla. Everything could still be explained by administrative necessity, by the need for standardization. He therefore decided not to act hastily. He instructed the solicitor and Sophie to keep every document confidential. Nothing was to be sent through official channels. Nothing was to be shared with anyone outside. Everything remained in the house, awaiting the right moment. The following days passed in tense silence. Edward continued working with the solicitor, examining every clause and every repair record. The atmosphere at Bagshot Park grew heavier. Family meals took place with fewer words than usual. Sophie asked her husband once more, "Should we speak to someone?" Edward shook his head. "Not yet. Let us see what they do next." He chose to observe. He wanted to see how Camilla's side would react once they realized he was examining the old papers. If they continued to push hard, the differences between the old files and the new requests would become still clearer. If they drew back, the pressure would ease for a time. Either way, he needed more time to consolidate his position. Meanwhile, the external review continued. Questions from the auditors kept arriving, probing ever more deeply into control and the possibility of adjusting the agreement. Edward answered briefly correctly, without revealing that he held documents capable of rebutting them. That restraint required considerable calm. Yet he knew that if he lost composure early, everything could turn more unfavorable. By the end of that week, the file on Edward's desk had grown considerably thicker. The solicitor confirmed once again that the right of occupation at Bagshot Park could not be altered easily. Sophie's tiara also rested on firm ground to be recognized as a private gift. Still, Edward did not feel secure. He understood that paperwork was only one part. The other side was playing on the board of procedure and timing. And he decided to continue keeping what he held confidential, waiting to see Camilla's next move. When word reached Camilla's office that Edward was examining the old papers, the reaction was swift. The earlier unhurried atmosphere disappeared. Camilla demanded at once that every file connected with the review be brought under a single point of control. Every document, every draft, every previous exchange had to be recalled and tightly supervised. She did not want any trail left outside her sight. In the hurried internal meetings that followed, certain earlier drafts were brought out for re-examination. Those drafts had once contained fairly strong language about the possibility of reclaiming Bagshot Park or altering the right of occupation. Now they were revised. Hard language was softened. Passages that could be read as an intention to strip rights directly were rewritten into more neutral phrasing. Camilla's name, already rare, was pushed still further from the sensitive documents. A legal advisor spoke up in one meeting. "If the old drafts remain, they will be hard to explain later." Camilla answered briefly. "Clean them. Keep everything under control." Alongside the revision of the files, the method of communication changed. Emails that had once recorded detailed instructions were gradually replaced by face-to-face meetings. No written traces remained that could easily be stored or copied. Important decisions were conveyed orally, making the source of direction far harder to identify. Who stood behind the moves, who first proposed the ideas, all were deliberately blurred. At Bagshot Park, Edward gradually became aware of the change. The records he had previously seen disappeared from the common system or were replaced by more neutral versions. Questions from the auditors suddenly grew more cautious. He understood at once that evidence was being erased. The differences he had noted between the old files and the new requests would now be difficult to prove in origin. One evening, he sat with Sophie in the study. On the desk lay the collection of documents he had gathered. Edward remained silent for a long time. He knew that if he continued only to observe the situation, would grow steadily more disadvantageous. The moment when the king would return fully to his duties was approaching. If the matter dragged on until then without action, he might be forced into compromise. He therefore reached a decision. He asked the solicitor to help compile everything that had been uncovered: the Bagshot Park agreement, the repair costs, the correspondence concerning the tiara, and the differences between the earlier and later drafts. Everything was arranged into a clear, logical file free of emotional accusation. He would take it to Charles as soon as the king was ready to receive full business again. While Edward prepared, Camilla continued to trust her strategy. She believed that if the issue were kept internal long enough, by the time Charles returned to full health and a full diary, Edward would eventually have to accept some form of compromise. She did not think her brother-in-law would dare to place the entire matter before the king with so carefully prepared a dossier. In Camilla's eyes, time was on her side. Silence and the cleaning of the files would make everything gradually fade until no one wished to dig deeper. She did not know that at Bagshot Park, Edward had exhausted his patience with mere defense. He was preparing to move to another step. The file was completed in the final days before Charles formally resumed his duties. Sophie helped her husband check every page. The atmosphere in the house grew more strained than ever. Both understood that once that dossier was laid on the king's desk, nothing would remain solely under their control. A week later, when King Charles formally resumed the full handling of his duties, the rhythm at Buckingham Palace gradually returned to something closer to normal. Meetings were rearranged, the diary filled again. In those first days, Edward requested a private audience. He brought the carefully prepared file. The meeting took place in the king's study, attended only by the two brothers and an independent legal advisor. Edward set out the entire sequence clearly and in order. He began with the Bagshot Park review and the way the questions had shifted from costs to the remaining term of the lease and the question of control. He spoke of the request for an inventory of Sophie's jewellery, particularly the tiara, and the way the inspectors had pressed for proof of provenance that worked against her. Then, he pointed to the differences between the earlier and later drafts, the revision of the files, and the transfer of exchanges to oral meetings. Charles listened without interruption. When Edward finished, the king turned to the independent legal advisor who had already examined the file. The conclusion was brief but firm. The Bagshot Park agreement remained fully in force. Edward's right of occupation could not be altered by an internal administrative decision alone. Assets proved to be private gifts to Sophie could not automatically be brought under central management. Charles took up several of the original review papers and read them again. He recognized that their content went far beyond the scope of authority Camilla's office had been given during the period when he reduced his work. The matter was no longer a routine cost-cutting exercise. He asked to see Camilla the same day. The conversation took place in an atmosphere of controlled tension that could almost be cut with a knife. Charles placed the file on the table, his voice cold. "Has your office been driving this review?" Camilla sat upright, meeting the king's gaze. "I wish to unify the management of royal assets. At a time when the budget is under pressure, nothing can be left outside proper control." Charles pushed an earlier draft towards her. "This is not unification. This is the narrowing of my brother's rights." And when attention was drawn to it, the files were revised and exchanges moved to oral meetings. "How do you explain that?" Camilla's jaw tightened slightly, her voice hardening. "I never ordered repossession. I only required a review. If anyone exceeded the proper limits, that was not my intention." Charles looked at her longer. "You head that office. Ultimately, every instruction carries your responsibility. Efficiency does not mean forcing Edward to prove what has long been recognized. Nor does it mean erasing traces when discovery is made." Camilla was silent for a few seconds, then spoke more quietly, yet still with pressure. "I deny any intention to strip anyone of rights. I simply did what I believed necessary for the royal household." Charles cut her short, his tone decisive. "Enough! Any examination of Bagshot Park that points towards repossession or alteration of the right of occupation is to stop completely. Edward's long-term right of occupation remains unchanged. The tiara and Sophie's other private gifts do not fall under central assets. From now on, your office is not to initiate similar reviews without my clear agreement. The air in the room grew thick. Camilla finally gave a short nod and said nothing more. Edward had protected what belonged to his family. Bagshot Park remained in his and Sophie's hands. The personal jewelry was not reclassified. Yet after that meeting, the atmosphere between him and Camilla became markedly cooler. Family gatherings carried a new caution. Greetings were shorter. Eyes met less often. Trust among members of the royal family had been affected, even if no one put it into words. In the days that followed, the review was formally closed. There was no large announcement, no public explanation. Everything was handled internally. But the after effects remained. Edward returned to Bagshot Park with a feeling that was both relief and heaviness. He had kept the family's assets, yet he also understood that relations within the royal family would henceforth be different. Sophie stood beside her husband and said little. Both knew that this victory had not come from noisy confrontation, but from patience and from evidence prepared at the right moment. If you were Prince Edward, would you remain silent in order to preserve family harmony, or would you oppose Camilla in order to protect Bagshot Park and Sophie's rights? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy.